You are watching the press preview, a first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive. In the next half hour, we'll see what's making the headlines with economics correspondent at The Spectator, Kate Andrews, and Guardian columnist Zoe Williams. So let's see what's on some of those front pages for you now. The Guardian preempts another nurses' strike next week as they warn patients could be put at risk if no resolution is found. The headline, Chief Nurses warn over deadlock on NHS pay. She still doesn't get it, reads the front of the Metro, as they comment on the publication of a 4,000-word essay about Liz Truss's time as Prime Minister. While the Eye says in its headline, Truss sparks Tory turmoil over tax cuts. The Financial Times reports on Beijing's reaction to the USA's decision to shoot down a Chinese balloon. Friends of Nicola Bulley say vile theories shared online about her disappearance are incredibly hurtful to her family, according to The Express. The last images of Nicola, captured from a doorbell camera, feature on the front of the Mirror, which says 1 hour later, she vanished. And the front of the Daily Star looks at more icy weather on the way. A reminder that by scanning the QR code you'll see on screen during the programme, you can check out the front pages of tomorrow's newspapers while you watch us. And we are joined tonight by economics correspondent at The Spectator, Kate Andrews, and Guardian columnist Zoe Williams. Welcome to you both. Let us start with the front page of the Eye and their headline, Truss sparks Tory turmoil over tax cuts. Not that easy for me to say. Perhaps not that easy for Liz Truss to read. Not very favourable headlines following her 4,000-word essay. Kate.
So after this huge splash that Liz Truss has made in the Sunday Telegraph, her 4,000-word essay on her view of her premiership, what happened and the lessons she learned, we're now having a lot of the reaction to that. And it's very telling that some of the left-leaning papers, we have those first. We haven't seen the front page of the Daily Telegraph, for example, yet, or the Mail. It'll be interesting to see their take. So far, unsurprisingly, it's very critical of what the former Prime Minister had to say. Liz Truss, in a crux and in a nutshell, I think here is asking the readers to think to themselves, look, I diagnosed the problem correctly. Please put more emphasis on that than the proposed solutions I put forward, which did not go as well. And I think that's a big ask. It's a tough sell. And what we're seeing so far in a lot of the headlines, and the Eye included, is that it seems that this is stirring up a lot of frustration in the Tory party, in her own party. And it's, getting headlines of civil war and all the rest of it. But really that fundamental debate that started during the leadership election last year between Rishi Sunak and Liz Truss about when is appropriate to cut taxes, how you cut those taxes, and crucially, whether or not you can finance those tax cuts through more borrowing is still playing out in the Tory party. It didn't go anywhere. And the fact that Liz Truss is returning so quickly, I mean, it's very vivid in our memories what happened. It was only just a few months ago. The fact that she's returning so quickly suggests that she feels that she's been vindicated very quickly. Whether or not her party and the public agree is a different matter.
Yes, and Zoe, she's saying that she simply wasn't given the support. She's not apologising directly, but suggesting that her ideas were correct, but the infrastructure around her wasn't there to support her.
So there's a sort of logical problem at the crux of her argument, which is twofold, right? Firstly, experts didn't warn her, and secondly, she was stitched up by the left establishment. A lot of people are going to be very surprised to hear the Treasury and, the international bond markets called the left-wing establishment. But even if we accept her proposition that it was a left-wing establishment that stitched her up, it would make sense for her not to listen to them if they were giving her advice, because obviously she thought she was kind of ideologically opposed to them. Having said that, she also says that she wasn't given any advice, even though many, many people did give her advice, and many people advised her not to do what she did. So there's a sort of veracity problem, there's a credibility problem, there's a logic problem. There are all kinds of problems at the core of her argument, which I don't think are going to really do much to roll back the image she accrued of being a sort of flapping, incompetent chaos monkey. But actually, I think what people will respond most strongly to is the fact that, she had 4,000 words here. Not one of them was sorry. And many, many people, myself included, have seen our mortgages double as a direct result of that period of turmoil. And never mind the kind of long-term consequences of that for the next 2-5 years, depending on where you manage to fix. There was a huge number of weeks in which people were genuinely in financial terror and remain so, and any time there might have been to kind of meet the headwinds of high inflation and energy costs, she wasted with this mad gamble. So I think people will what they'll really respond badly to is the lack of any penitence, which has caused so much hardship. But obviously, if you wanted to really pick the piece apart, you could have a field day.
Very interesting description. I don't think I've ever heard her described as a chaos monkey before. That's the first, and I've heard many descriptions of Liz Truss. Kate, why is she doing this now? I mean, is this really a strike at Rishi Sunak? Is she trying to undermine him?
I think there are a myriad of things going on here. I think she's looking at the growth forecasts that have come out so far under Rishi's premiership. Of course, so much of that reflects what's already happened, and indeed that includes her own mini budget. And she's thinking to herself, this is my moment to strike. I was talking about growth. The UK looks as if it's going into recession if it's not already there. This is my moment to comment. This is my moment essentially to start my comeback. I think Zoe makes some important points there, though, about in this 4,000-word essay. She does say things like, I made mistakes and I'm not blameless, but it is constantly placing the blame elsewhere. She is looking at different institutions and establishments. And the question that she's posing, again, a really tough sell, is to what extent did just a perfect economic storm gather over the UK during her 49 days? And to what extent was it her fault? And it is very difficult, for example, to remove all the blame and to put it on the Office for Budget Responsibility and their negative forecasts. Look, in the past, they have been known to be quite negative about supply side reforms, but there was no forecast last autumn because Liz Truss decided that the OBR was going to be sidelined. It's very difficult to point the finger elsewhere, especially as a free marketeer, which she's, claiming to be, when it was international markets world over, which did not have a political agenda, but we're looking at her plan to do tens of billions of pounds of deficit finance tax cuts and simply said these numbers don't add up. This is not credible. And there is still no accountability there. There's still no talk about the spending. And so I think we have to remember that this is from her perspective. This is her 4,000 words. This is how she sees it. It's very clear that she doesn't regret terribly what she did. She even says in the piece, I think if we stuck by it, it would have worked. We would have got growth. And so we have to take it for what it is, which is her account of things. But again, because she's decided to intervene so quickly after the fact, a lot of people will have an account of what happened. We all remember it very well. And there's going to be a lot of challenge to her timeline, a lot of challenge to those details, and big questions around why she isn't taking more accountability. Ultimately, she was in charge.
Zoe, the Metro saying that she's accused her successor of presiding over a country sliding into stagnation. Not mentioned by name, as I said before, but clearly an attack and really repositioning herself as perhaps coming back onto the political stage.
Well, I mean, absolutely. And this is the actually interesting bit, quite aside from me calling her names. Why on earth are newspapers admitting in the testimony of not just Liz Truss, but Boris Johnson is launching this incredible kind of leadership campaign? There isn't a leadership contest. So why is Johnson acting as though there is, and Truss acting as though there is? The reason is they're being admitted into the discourse by papers like the Sunday Telegraph. And if that's the case, that it's because Rishi Sunak has lost some trust in the newspapers he'd expect to back him. So I'm not sure, because the Telegraph has been quite wild recently, I'm not sure whether they're reflecting a kind of broader view in the right-wing press or whether they're the canaries in the coal mine. But certainly Sunak won't be looking at this and thinking, I can just write this off as the kind of peevish ramblings of my predecessor. Certainly he has to take this seriously, because if it were just a kind of peevish outburst, there's no way she would have been given that space for it.
Interesting. Kate, tomorrow she's giving her first interview with Spectator television. Is that recorded or will that be live? And do we know any more about that? Can you tell us?
That's reported. It will be airing at 5 p.m. tomorrow evening on Spectator TV. The interviewers are our editor, Fraser Nelson, and our new political editor, Katie Bowles, and they'll be following up on a lot of the questions that we've been asking coming out of this op-ed, and I think pushing that slightly further as well. And I slightly disagree with Zoe about her point that, publications are giving this leeway, this time to these politicians. These are former prime ministers, and when a former prime minister from either of the major parties makes a intervention, it usually does end up on the front page of a newspaper. And I think it is frankly very insightful as to what's happening in the Tory party right now, because that debate from the leadership campaign last summer, it has not ended. This is a party that is truly at war with itself over the fact that it's brought the tax burden to a 72-year high, but also the fact that it can't really name anything it would cut in terms of spending to bring that tax burden down, because we have to pay for these things. And I think that, these are sort of fascinating interventions, and almost regardless of what you think of them, it really speaks to the mood of politics right now. And I have absolutely no doubt we'll be getting more insight on Spectator TV tomorrow at 5 p.m.
I'll allow you that that plug. Only once though. Zoe, let's move to a different story in The Guardian. And this chief nurses warn over deadlock on NHS pay. It is looking increasingly as if this is not going to be solved anytime soon.
It's so fascinating, this, because, on the eve of the strikes, of the kind of first big strikes, before the RCN even had the whole body of ballots, there was a long period when they only had kind of majority in Wales and Scotland, and the kind of English regional unions weren't quite on side. Even then, it looked like absolutely bizarre stubbornness from the government, because they weren't just saying, we can't meet you there, we'll meet you here. They were actively refusing to discuss the matters with Pat Cullen. They were actively refusing to sit round a table. And when they did sit round a table, ministers were explicitly saying, we can talk about anything except pay. Now, that is, you can't negotiate in a pay dispute like that. You have to actually talk about pay. So I thought, my view then was that they would see sense, because the public is very much behind the nurses union and very much behind all the NHS staff. Actually, ambulance drivers are on extraordinary polling figures in favour of their strike action. So there's no way they're going to just sit it out and get public opinion to side with the government, or if that's what they think they're going to do, I think they're going to be disappointed.
We read, Kate, that a government spokesperson said the Health Secretary is ready to resume talks. Should we read some optimism into that?
I think we've seen in recent weeks that there has been a shift from the government and there is more willingness to compromise. But the government feels strongly, I think, especially from the Treasury, that part of its plan to have inflation is linked to being very cautious about pay raises, especially inflation-based ones, as we now see that headline figure coming down. I think nurses are the area where there's going to be most flexibility, because, as Zoe says, there's a lot of sympathy across the board and a feeling that, especially after COVID, something has to be done on pay. But we have to look at the whole spectrum of pay here, because we don't take pensions and those gold-plated pensions that these public sector workers have into account either. Now, that doesn't help with the day-to-day costs and the cost of living. Maybe we need to be more flexible in those negotiations. But when you look at an average nurse's salary, you can essentially double it when you factor in the pension, something that no private sector worker can really boast. So we have to have a more holistic talk here. The main thing I take away from the Guardian front page is that nobody's pretending anymore that these strikes aren't having an effect on patient safety. The unions are admitting it. The NHS Confederation has recently admitted it. This is getting very concerning. And as these walkouts continue, there's no pretending that it's not having an impact on patient safety.
Kate and Zoe, for the moment, thank you. Stay right where you are. We're going to take a break. Coming up, residents in the Ukrainian city of Bakhmut are preparing for a fresh Russian attack. We'll discuss that and more next. Welcome back. You're watching the press preview. Still with me, the economics correspondent at The Spectator, Kate Andrews, and Guardian columnist Zoe Williams. Welcome back to both of you. We're going to kick off with you this time, Zoe, and having a look at the front page of the Financial Times. Ukraine bracing for a new assault. Talk us into this.
I mean, it's absolutely... What's really extraordinary about this story is, and I think this is a kind of this is a castigation of news generally, international news generally, is that as soon as it dies down or as soon as interest goes away, there's this kind of bedrock assumption that things are improving in Ukraine. And they're not improving. The longer winter goes on, the worse it gets. The Russian assaults are ceaseless. And however bad the Russian casualty numbers are, it doesn't actually take away from their military capability, which is still immense. So, this is the fight Zelensky has constantly, is to keep in front and center in the world's eyes just how much jeopardy they're in constantly. And is this going to be is this going to be a kind of new phase of the war, i.e., closer to the end than the middle, or closer to the middle than the beginning? I'm not sure that we could say that from here, and I'm not sure that between the Russians trying to talk up their capabilities and Zelensky talking up how much help he needs, it's really difficult to get a clear picture of whether this is a kind of step change in aggression. But it's certainly a really devastating time for the nation.
Yes, Ukraine expecting a large-scale offensive by Russian forces any time now, imminently, and much of the fighting has been surrounding Bakhmut in the east of Ukraine, Kate.
Yes, just to piggyback a bit on what Zoe said there, and to think about the other countries involved in this now. Over the past few weeks, President Zelensky has been making his pitch, making his plea to countries like Germany to be sending jets, to be sending other kinds of military equipment. And Germany, a few weeks back, they did change their mind on tanks, but he's constantly having to battle to get more weaponry, to be able to put up these defenses, to be able to prepare for, as Zoe points out, the constant aggression that's taking place, even if it isn't showing up on our front pages daily anymore. And it is going to be very interesting, I think, over the next 6 months to see that shift in the Allies' perspective, because if it does seem like this is, going to be going on for quite some time, especially as Ukraine at the moment anyway suggests that, they are fighting Russia out of Crimea and all the rest of it, how those opinions start to change in Germany, throughout Europe, in the UK, and the US, and whether Zelensky and those other world leaders remain on the same page.
Yes, and we read that one military advisor saying that the assault could come within the next 10 days. So this really is imminent. Let's move to The Guardian, Zoe, and this story about 1 in 10 police officers slipping through vetting. That's extremely alarming.
So it's actually two stories in one. This, on the one hand, 1 in 10 police officers has an actual conviction or a known contact with a criminal underworld of some sort, and is just getting into the Met Police anyway. And on the other hand, there's a massive backlog of testimony from female police officers on how much misogyny they faced within the force. So, the David Carrick case really lifted the lid on an institutional culture, which actually a lot of people have been saying for quite a long time is institutionally sexist and skating on the edge of criminality. For a really long time, people have been saying that. But it's sort of catastrophic for the Met that everything's coming out at once. So, on the back of David Carrick, there are going to be numerous prosecutions of other officers. Meanwhile, the ambient mood music in the force itself is shown to be really damaging everywhere you look. There is a real case here about whether or not the Met Police can continue and just reform, or whether something much more radical has to be undertaken, because it doesn't look like a few bad apples anymore.
Yes, and the HM Inspector of Constabulary, Matt Parr, has said that there was a real problem with misogyny within the police that had to be tackled, adding that most, if not all, serving female officers had to endure sexual assault or inappropriate behaviour from fellow officers. I mean, this is endemic, isn't it, Kate?
That's a staggering comment from him in this piece. And this is really a terrifying story, to think that 1 in 10 officers are slipping through the vetting process. And it's a reminder that those sort of headline figures and promises aren't all that they're cracked up to be. I mean, you have Boris Johnson promising 20,000 additional police officers, but it's the merit of those police officers. It's whether or not they're skilled inadequate to do the job. It's whether or not they have the personality and the professionalism to do the job. And I fear we're discovering that too many people are being approved, probably to achieve some kind of target, who should never be considered in the first place because they have criminal records or a background that would just be
Indeed.
completely inappropriate. And
Kate.
officers are struggling from this, and civilians are too.
Kate, thank you. Sorry, we're running out of time there. And Zoe, thank you both.